Hi everyone, this is Professor Hai Nguyen, and I want to welcome you to my tutorial video for midterm number 2. Right? In this video, again, I'm going to try to make it short because unlike midterm number 1, where I have to explain to you the format of the test and familiarize you with ultimately the documents and the key terms and how to try to fit it all together, I'm hoping that this is your second time around, you understand what the format is, and you ought to also understand my expectations. And if there are room for improvements that you can make based on the comments that I made and the feedback that I have given you from midterm number 1, I hope you'll somewhat make those adjustments this time around. So let's dive right into it. Midterm number 2, what are we covering, guys? Basically, we're looking at American history, right, from the moment of independence, right? 1776. You have the Declaration of Independence. America goes to war against the British to try to gain their independence, if you will. So you're looking at 1776, and we're kind of going to take things up to around 1840. I would say 1840, right around there. In terms of the overall scheme of things, we might go beyond that a little bit. I know that midterm number 2, we're supposed to cover module 5 through 7, which we will, right? But if you look at the module 5 through 7, 2 of them were discussions looking at the electoral college and looking at the two-party system. Really, it was module number 6 that you really kind of dig into some content in regarding to the role of women during the American Revolution. So we have quite a bit of content. So you're going to have to rely on quite a bit from your reading, if you will. So chapters 7 through 11. However, I do want to say that there are going to be some content that goes beyond chapter number 11. Particularly, you have a little bit on women's rights activism. In chapter 12, it's a really short page, if you will, that talks about somewhat women's suffrage and their quest to try to get their right to vote. So just a little bit, so you don't really have to, we're not going to cover all of chapter 12, but I would like you to somewhat just to read that short section that says women rights activists, right, in chapter 12. And also we might, we are going to somewhat dip into chapter 13 as well, but really only in the beginning. It says the growing distinctiveness of the South, and you're looking at Cotton Kingdom and Slave Empire. So you got maybe like 2 or 3 pages there that really looks at the expansion of cotton into the lower South. And I will explain why that is the case. But I do want to make that warning ahead of time that you're gonna have some content that goes beyond chapter number 11, but there are a couple of pages, again, doesn't really deal with chapter 12 and 13 overall, but I would like you to somewhat connect those pieces, if you will, because I have some themes, I have some ideas that I would like you to analyze as a whole, and it's just kind of weird how they just kind of sneak women suffrage movement and also Cotton Kingdom right at the beginning of chapter 13, if you will. So what we're looking at is, starting point is Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution. This is why I have this fabulous painting right here that looks at the polling of King George III during the American Revolution as a celebration of their Declaration of Independence, right? And I also have, of course, that famous passage, right, from the Declaration of Independence, right, that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Okay, I think that's a great starting point, because what you're going to be focusing on for this exam is the beginning of the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, because why? It really sets the tone. It creates the foundation for what this nation will be about, right? That democratic ideology that all men are created equal. And what you are going to see is that it's amazing that words have meaning and they have impact on society, because truly, people are going to believe it, right? Not just men, but also women and Native Americans and slaves and so many other groups, right? Even up until today, people are still inspired by that powerful democratic ideology. Ironically, the founding fathers, when they say all men, they really just meant men like themselves, right? Rich property holder, if you will. But this thing is just going to snowball, right? Like every generation, and every group is just going to cling on and somewhat embrace that democratic ideology. And by the 1830s, you got Andrew Jackson, right? He gets elected in 1828, and he is somewhat the embodiment of that democratic ideology, if you will, or supposedly, right? You got a Jacksonian democracy, as it was called. So you can see that the American Revolution sets the foundation for that democratic ideology, right? And by the 1830s, it's coming to fruition. It's becoming a reality, right? So you have the Americans, they're breaking independence, right? They're shifting from a monarchy, and they're going to try to establish a republic, right? This idea of a government based on representation, not so much based on mass participation. Remember, that's why we have the Electoral College, right? The discussion that you had, if you will. But the cat's out of the box when you say that all men are created equal. They really believe it, right? And things are going to snowball. And by the 1830s, you're going to have somewhat American democracy, right? Based on mass participation. So I'm sorry, I know it's a long intro, but one of my specialty was the American Revolution. So I'm really somewhat excited to talk to you about this topic. So that's somewhat what we're going to cover. The American Revolution from the 1770s all the way up to around 1840s, if you will, okay? Now, I do want to somewhat, once again, very similar to midterm number one, I have somewhat an idea. I have a speech that I don't want to give you the question away, but I really want to let you know ahead of time what you might want to be thinking about, right, in terms of your preparation. And what I have shared with you here is a speech by Frederick Douglass in 1847. Now, if you don't know anything about Frederick Douglass, it's okay. Think of Frederick Douglass as the 19th century version of what Martin Luther King was in the 20th century. And if you need to explain to you who Martin Luther King was, I don't even know what to say about that if you don't know who Martin Luther King was. So you might want to Google him, okay? But here you have Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, the great African-American speaker. He's a great orator, powerful, somewhat leader of the African-American community in the 19th century, really spoke out against slavery. So he gets a former slave himself, so he knows what slavery was about. So he goes to London and he makes this speech as to thank the British people for inviting him to come over to speak. But he really talks about the irony of it all, that you have America that was founded on freedom, independence, and equality, but yet how things develop and how things play out from the 1770s all the way up into 1840s, he describes the evolution of America and what's happening in America during those decades, if you will. He describes America as a nation of inconsistencies, right? A nation of inconsistency, okay? And trust me, as an immigrant myself, that was one of the things I noticed about America, that there's a lot of inconsistencies, if you will, or contradictions. So if you want to read his speech, it's a long speech, but in a nutshell, he talks about why America is really a nation of inconsistency for what's been happening from the moment of its founding to when he makes his speech, which is in 1847, right? That's what's going to be your job, right? So without me telling you what the question is, that's going to be somewhat your job, right? For how you prepare for this test, right? I hope you noticed that as you did your reading and as you analyze American history from the 1770s to the 1840s, that there really were contradictions in terms of how things play out. Because on the one hand, you have the rise of the republic, the rise of American democracy. But on the other hand, you have the expansion of slavery, right? You have the dispossession of Native American land once again, right? And then you also have women, right? And their inability to vote. But it's not just a matter of them unable to vote. There are going to be so many inequalities, right? So how do we come to grips with that? So I guess this is very similar to midterm number one, when I asked you to talk about somewhat how colonization had an impact, right, on the three continents, right? Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And I asked you to analyze various groups, right? Europeans, Africans, and also Native Americans, if you will. I guess for the second midterm, we're just focusing on America and its expansion, right? And its development and dealing with somewhat those contradictions or those inconsistencies, if you will. So I don't want to give the question away, right? But that's as far as I'm going to go to let you know what the second midterm is going to be about and what you need to pay attention and how you should organize somewhat the content, if you will, right? Off of what Frederick Douglass said, how America was somewhat a nation of inconsistency, right? So let's dive into the content itself, guys. So again, same format. You have 6 documents. In the first document, you have a pamphlet that was written in 1776 in the newspaper, the Maryland Gazette. And it's written by an anonymous writer. And ultimately, he's making a case for voting, right? Without property restrictions. Because back in the 1770s and all the way up until the 1830s, certain states, in order for you to vote, right, you needed to be a property holder. Now, for the writer of this pamphlet, he found that to be very unfair, right? In a country where you're saying that all men are created equal, that power comes from the people, that it is based on representation, that everybody should have a voice. And here is that contradiction, right? That ultimately you have voting requirements based on property. So the writer, he finds that to be very problematic. So I want you to analyze how he made his argument as to why that is unfair, and ultimately why that does not match with the promises of the American Revolution, right? So that's in document number 1. So pay close attention to how he makes his argument, right? Why property requirement was unfair, okay? So that's in the first document. In the second document, let me pull that up here. In the second document, what you're going to have is that this is the famous Declaration of Sentiment. Now, you have women who were actively involved in the abolitionist movement and so many other moral, somewhat social movements in the 1820s and 30s, if you will. But I always describe women activism in the 1820s and 30s as kind of like a boxer who's in a boxing match with 2 hands tied behind his back. And if you know anything about boxing, right, the most powerful tool that they have are their hands, right? And why I use that metaphor to describe women activism in the 1820s and 30s is that simply they want to make a change in a democratic society, but unfortunately, they don't have their most powerful tool, which is the right to vote. So as a result, women came together in 1848. You have suffragists coming together, women who wanted to push for voting, to give themselves the right to vote. And what they have done is that they have emulated the Declaration of Independence. That's why it's called the Declaration of Sentiment. But I want you to read this document because it's more than just women not having the right to vote. They want the right to vote because they want to address some of the inequalities that exist for them in the 19th century. And I know that we're talking about in the context of today of like the hashtag Me Too movement. We're talking about the rising of feminism, if you will, right? But I don't think you guys realize some of the inequalities that women had to suffer and experience in the 19th century. So I want you to read this document very clearly and understand why did women want the vote? Because they wanted to address some of the inequalities that existed between men and women under the law. So read this document very carefully, guys, right? Because it's going to address some of those inequalities, all right? So that's in document number 2. It's dealing with women's rights, right? And their right to vote and the treatment of women under the law, okay? So that's in document number 2. Document number 3 was written in 1773. It's written by a slave. His name is Felix, but he's written on the behalf of other slaves in the city of Boston, and they're writing this to the governor of Massachusetts. 1773. This is the lead up to the American Revolution. So read this petition very carefully, because Felix, this slave, is going to argue on the behalf of his fellow slaves as to why the state of Massachusetts should allow them to have their freedom, should also allow them for them to serve in the military and for them to fight for independence, if you will, right? So read this document very carefully and think about how the American Revolution and the ideas of freedom and equality had an impact on slaves themselves, right? That's somewhat why I'm assigning you this document. I want you to think about how the American Revolution had an impact, right, on slaves, right? And how it's gonna somewhat empower them to fight for their freedom, if you will, and how it inspires them to fight for equality, right, under those promises of the American Revolution. So that's from the African American slave perspective, right? And then document number 4, I have a speech that was given by Thomas Jefferson during his time as governor in 1788 in Virginia. And in this document, you can read his speech. And what he is trying to address were ultimately that contradiction that he himself wrote that all men are created equal. And as a result, you have the British, you have African Americans, you have Native Americans, right? Questioning Thomas Jefferson. How can you say that all men are created equal? And here you are, a slaveholder. That was not lost upon the British. They always criticized the American. Why are you the biggest somewhat proponent of freedom and democracy, but yet you are a slaveholder, right? And Thomas Jefferson, in this speech, he addresses that contradiction, right? As to why he wrote somewhat the Declaration of Independence, but also he is really addressing as to why African Americans and Native Americans do not qualify, right? When he said all men. So I want you to see somewhat that contradiction, right? How Thomas Jefferson justified his racism. So he really talks about what makes African Americans unique, what also makes Native Americans somewhat unique in a sense. But at the end of the day, he's trying to convince the American people why it was okay for him to exclude them and to deny them, and why they should continue to enslave, right? African slaves, if you will. So I want you to read this document very carefully and take, right, summarize, right, his prejudices as to why, what he holds against African Americans and what he holds against Native Americans. So that's in document number 4. And to play off of document number 4, document number 5, you have a speech by Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson, he is going to look up to Thomas Jefferson as his hero, as his somewhat inspiration, if you will. Now, Andrew Jackson is often credited as the man that ushers in democracy, right? This is the same guy that somewhat was voted in 1828, right? Really campaigned to the people, if you will. And once he comes into office, he's really going to fight on the behalf of independent farmers, if you will, right? That's why he goes to war against the Bank of the United States. So if you read that from the reading, if you will. But Andrew Jackson, even though he's credited as somewhat ushering in American democracy, that comes at a price, right? So in document number 5, what he was addressing was he's talking to Congress and he's trying to justify why Native Americans should be removed or relocated. That's really removal, right? So in this speech, I want you to read carefully how he explained removal of the Native Americans was beneficial both ways, right? For America and also for the Native Americans, if you will, right? So read this document very carefully as to how he makes that argument, why removal was the right decision, right? And again, this document itself is really to highlight somewhat the costs of Western expansion, right? And how they had an impact on Native Americans, right? And also looking at how America justify somewhat those actions, if you will, okay? Document number 6, this is very straightforward. What you see here, these were coins that were given to Native Americans out in the West as a way to somewhat establish friendly relations, establish somewhat trade, if you will. So this is an order from Thomas Jefferson. Again, somewhat the contradictions with Thomas Jefferson, if you will, because again, if you read his speech in document number 4, he makes it quite clear what his vision of Native Americans were, right? But also in document number 6, right? As you can see from these coins here, I think it sends a contradiction message, right? That he wants to establish peace and friendship with the Native Americans. So how do we deal with that contradiction, if you will, right? So that's in document number 6. And document number 7, what you're looking at is a map of voting restrictions being eliminated throughout America. So if you remember in the first document, you know, the writer was expressing his opposition towards the idea of having voters property requirement as a way to vote. But what you see in this map here, so the yellow, if you look at the yellow, those are the states that eliminated completely voting restrictions. So we call it white manhood suffrage. And what it means is if you look at the yellow, right, over time, it's expanding rapidly. And white manhood suffrage simply means if you want to vote, right, all you had to be was white and male, right? And you can see things are expanding, right, because of that democratic ideology established in the American Revolution, if you will, right? So as you can see, this is somewhat a plus, a positive, right, for white men, because again, this is a privilege that they have that no other group has, right? So that's in document number 7. So I want you to think about how the American Revolution had an impact on white men in particular, and how from the American Revolution all the way up until the 1830s, if you will, how the American Revolution somewhat benefited them in a sense, right? That's in the 1830s. So voting, right, was one of the privilege that they had that other groups did not have, right, in particular. And last but not least, this is document number 8. This is a map of the Missouri Compromise. It's 1820 and 1821. And you look at this map, there was a controversy in 1820. Missouri wanted to come in as a slave state, but they worried that the balance of power between free states and slave states would be somewhat tip in favor of slave states. And as a result, they came to a compromise. They created a state of Maine at the top to balance the power. But what is significant about this map is that it shows you that inconsistency and contradiction. That America was founded on the idea of freedom, equality, that all men are created equal, but at the same time, look at its expansion over time. You have new states like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, right? Kentucky, Missouri. And if you look at the color of those states, right, what are they? They're slave states, right? What those states represent in the lower South, they're what we historians call the second Middle Passage. If you remember from the first midterm, you look at the Middle Passage, which was the journey that imported enslaved Africans from Africa over to the Americas. Now, the second Middle Passage, what they're referring to is ultimately the importation of slaves in America from the upper South, which is from Virginia, that had the largest slave population, South Carolina, which had the second largest slave population. And as a result, as America expands in the lower South, we call it Cotton Kingdom, right? Because they're growing cotton, and cotton was very profitable. If you know anything about cotton, it requires a lot of labor, because what you have to do is you got to pick the seeds. You got to separate the seeds from the cotton fiber itself. So it requires a lot of labor, right? So if you look at it, the Missouri Compromise is expansion of slavery, right? Throughout the 1820s, if you will. So think of it in that context, because I promise you, when you look at the key terms, if you're just going to Google the banning of slave importation in 1808, some of you are going to mistake and say, well, America did the right thing, right? They banned slave importation. So there was a sense that the founding fathers wanted to end slavery, if you will, right? It's half truth. They had an idea that maybe if they banned slave importation, that slavery was going to just naturally die out, right? But the problem was, what they didn't see coming was that you have the creation of the Eli Whitney cotton gin that really accelerated cotton production, right, in the South. And as a result, cotton became a booming industry. And after 1808, right, yes, slave importation from Africa was banned. But there's a reason why that ban is going to be beneficial for states like Virginia and South Carolina. Because why? If you cannot get your slaves from Africa, you're going to have to get it from somewhere else. And that somewhere else is obviously Virginia and South Carolina, which had a large population of slaves. All right? Now, you don't need to be an economist to understand, but the more demand that you have of a good, the prices of that good goes up, right? So the expansion of slavery, right? The banning of slave importation overseas really benefited Southern planter slaveholders, because why? The prices of their slaves goes up dramatically. Supply and demand. That's how it works, guys, right? So document number 8 is really an illustration of that expansion of slavery, of Cotton Kingdom, and ultimately also an illustration, right, of that contradiction of America evolution and growth. That here you have a nation founded on what ideas of equality, freedom, liberty. In time, you also have the expansion of what? Slavery. Okay? So that's basically the documents, guys. The key terms, I'm not going to go over them because you have that information inside the book. So I expect you to somewhat do your preparation. So what I would do is, again, I really recommend that you think about how this country was founded, the ideas that it was built upon, right? Think about somewhat that democratic ideology that was established during the American Revolution, and think about the growth of America from the 1870s all the way up into the 1840s. And think about that statement that Frederick Douglass made, that America, right, from its founding to the 1840s, a nation of inconsistencies, right? Inconsistency, contradiction, whatever you want to call it, right? And if you look at those sources, I think it's easy to say that there are a couple of groups of people that I would like you to somewhat analyze, right? White men, African Americans, Native Americans, and also women. Those 4 groups, right? Make it easier on yourself. Think about those 4 groups and how the growth of America, right? The expansion of America over time from the 1770s to the 1830s, right? impacted those groups. And I think if you look at those groups in particular, you can kind of see what Frederick Douglass was pointing at when he says that America is a nation of inconsistencies. Okay? That's what you have to do for midterm number 2. So again, guys, same format, 2-hour tests. 6 of the documents need to be used effectively in your essay, if you will, in the proper context with lots of details, right? Leave everything you know, right? On your essay, if you will, right? And again, I really want to just remind you, take a first couple minutes of the test, 5 minutes so of the test to do an outline. So that way you read the question very carefully, you create an outline, and you figure out what documents you will be using, right? What key terms go with each document and how you're going to somewhat organize your documents and key terms as a larger point of your essay, right? As part of your thesis, okay? So that would be my recommendation. Make the adjustment from the first midterm, if you will, in terms of whatever comment I made, right? Take that into consideration because, again, my expectations only go higher up from here because, again, you know what my expectations are. You know the test format, right? It's the same. So best of luck, guys. And again, please make sure you complete the test before the due date. If you have any question, please feel free. Do not hesitate to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to answer whatever question you may have. Okay, guys? But just think about it. America from the 1770s all the way up to the 1840s, right? The growth of America, right? The American Revolution, how it had an impact on those 4 groups, if you will, right? And why Frederick Douglass would somewhat refer to America as a nation of inconsistency. Something to think about. All right, guys? All right, so best of luck, all right? And I will see you for the final. Thanks, guys.